I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present on the book of Samuel and the stories of David. As many of you know, I came to St. Michael's a couple of years ago, and it was always my dream to be able to share with the congregation from the perspective of me being a lay person the thousands of images that live in my mind that help me on my path to to the spirit and to devotion. And so this is a really special moment for me, and this is such a difficult moment for all of us. Many of us are heartbroken and it just seems as if we are overwhelmed by what is happening right around us and farther around us. And I am really hoping and praying that by sharing these beautiful images that from the story of David, that we can use art as a remedy. I have always used art as a form of healing for myself and with others. And just many of you know my story, but I'm just going to say a little bit that, I got to college when I was about 17 years old. I was 17 years old, and I had really not been churched, so to speak. And the way I reached my spiritual path was this stream of beautiful images that I took into my soul at a very young age through studying great works of art. And I studied the Bible as a form of literature, and it was analyzed in that way. But it sort of allowed my spiritual life to incarnate through images into the path that took me to the Episcopal Church, where I was confirmed this spring. And I just want to say thank you to Rector John and St. Michael's for allowing me to use this format to share what I would consider to be a kind of retrospectroscope, something like that, where I look back over my life to when I was 17 and saw all these great works of art, and then was planning to, did my thesis on how Rembrandt turned matter into spirit, which was not well received, as I expect you can imagine. And then went from there to becoming fully incarnated as a mother and caring for my children. And then realizing I needed to help the world in a different way, went into my medical training and became a physician, and later became ill myself and became a grandmother, and all of these different experiences, which I've lived through, helped me to look back at these images of the story of David with greater richness, which I would like to share with you today. So I will begin. For me, the story of David and the book of Samuel start with Hannah. It starts with this amazing woman who was, a second wife, who was childless and ignored, and, put her time into studying scripture and being reverent, but she missed the experience of being able to give her body over to the formation of another and allowing, her own body to be taken over and in some ways broken in order to give a new life the opportunity to unfold. And this was a source of tremendous grief for her. And she went off to see Eli, the priest, and to pray to Eli and to God that somehow this burden of childlessness would be taken from her. And this is a painting by Rembrandt. It was one of his earliest paintings, and it was painted in 1631. He was born in 1606. And he often used the women in his life as models of the spiritual images he was trying to convey. And here we have a picture of his mother as Hannah reading the scriptures in Hebrew with this deep red, heartfelt, almost velveteen robe and the golden shield. And this is how we enter into the story of David, is through Hannah. And this is a terrible slide, but I just wanted to give you an impression. This is a drawing by Rembrandt later in his life. Rembrandt drew the way he breathed. He would have an idea and it would just come out in a sketch, and he would put it on the nearest, if it were modern days, it would be a cocktail napkin probably, or a piece of paper towel, or an Amazon bag. He would just pour out his inner spiritual life into his drawings. And in this drawing, which is made with a reed pen and bistre, he shows the moment where Hannah is opening her heart to the priest Eli. A bistre, by the way, is a kind of it refers to an area in Wales where a certain type of beechwood was burned into soot, and the soot had this resonant sort of gray-brown color with a yellow luminosity. And artists like to use it to light up the linear part of their drawings with soul and warmth. And you can see, I think, right away that there are associations of this figure, Hannah, with the Annunciation in the New Testament, the sense of surprise and wonder and giving herself over. And Hannah, of course, the name evokes the name of Anna, the mother of the Virgin Mary. And all of the names that we'll hear today have deep spiritual meaning. This is an image of Hannah receiving her blessing and thanking God for that blessing. It's from a Psalter from the 10th century. A Psalter was a collection of David's Psalms. We're talking about David, and David as a poet. And this was a volume that was created in the 10th century to allow people access to those 150 Psalms, many of which were actually written by David. And it's tiny. It's like 14 inches by 12 inches. There are a number of full miniatures that were painted at that time. And I think you can see the beautiful reverence and the celestial blue surrounding her, and the warm reds of her cloak. And you can see the little hand of God up in the upper right-hand corner with the rays streaming down. If I were able to do this presentation in person, of course, I would be moving all around and showing you things, but I have to use my words, which takes a little bit longer. So you'll have to excuse that I'm using words to do something I normally would show with gesture. So once Hannah's wish is brought to fruition, she bears her child Samuel. Samuel meaning heard by God. And it's connected to the name Saul, but it's filled out, and Samuel will become a seer. And before she turns him over to Eli the priest, Hannah is still in this Rembrandt painting, teaching him. Oh, and now before I talk more about that, I just wanted to share Hannah's Song of Praise. I wanted to do that actually back here while we're here. Hannah's Song of Praise, just a small bit of it, which is so much like the Song of Mary. The Lord makes poor and rich. He humbles, he also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the ash heap to sit them with nobles, and he gives them a seat of honor as an inheritance. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. So we are being set up for this seer Samuel, who will be the one who anoints the kings, who is God's messenger, who will pass on God's will to the people of Israel. if they will listen. And in this late painting of Rembrandt's, there's this deeply reverential moment of Hannah teaching her young son Samuel before she generously gives him over to his training as a seer. And this is a drawing either by Rembrandt or someone in his school. It's very vague, but it's just the suggestion of this generosity. Hannah hasn't given up her body and soul in order that she herself can profit from it. She's doing it so that she can give her son over to God. And this is that moment when she's doing that in this sort of very spiritual space. You can see the arch suggested at the top, maybe even a sense of Jerusalem in the background. And there's this deeply reverential moment. Now, we're going to move ahead in a certain way because it is Samuel's um, requirement for the people of Israel to anoint a king. You have to remember the tribes of Israel are all sort of scattered about, and the Ark of the Covenant's in a tent somewhere, and the Philistines are all roaring at the borders, and the Israeli people have lost their direct connection with God, and they're calling out for a king to help them. And Samuel is reluctant, but he finds this individual Saul, who physically is a foot taller than those around him. And he has gone up and he's been prophesying with the prophets. He's spiritually way open to the spirits, all of them, good and bad. And equally, he's subject to deep depths of despair. In modern days, we might say that he had a form of a mental illness, which we treat now with medication. But at that time, the only treatment for these wild swings between being manic and depressed was harmony, was the music of the spheres, you might see. So Saul is really a tragic figure. He has a moment where he is able to meet what God is asking for him, but his soul is so riotous that he cannot control its soaring and its plunging. And David is actually called from the fields to play his harp to him to soothe his soul. And this is how we become introduced to David. And when Samuel realizes that Saul cannot carry out the mission of the Lord, he goes in search of the one who can. And he goes to Bethlehem, Bethlehem, the place where the Lord will be announced to the shepherds. He goes to Bethlehem, to Jesse's house, and he looks at all the seven sons of Jesse and he tests them spiritually, and none of them passes the test. And then he finds out, oh, there's another son, the youngest son, who's out in the field tending the sheep. So we're brought right into this theme of the chosen one being the youngest son. We go sort of to the eighth day, and one of my favorite books of all time, by the way, is the book called The Eighth Day by Thornton Wilder, and it's one of the top three books I ever recommend to anyone who asks for a book recommendation. When you come to the eighth day, it allows something new to enter in. So here he finds this shepherd boy who is out tending his sheep, and he's not just a mild-mannered poet, music shepherd. He is able to fight with a lion to protect his sheep. And David secretly anoints him at that time. This is just a detail of this, the way this is a Rembrandt painting of Saul and David, David playing the harp or the lyre to soothe the tormented soul of David. And you can see that young tenderness in the music that he's playing for Saul. This is a detail of Saul's hand, which you can imagine is probably tremoring on his spear, which he is about in madness to send over trying to pierce the heart of David because he is so tormented that he wants to kill that which is soothing him. This, I'll just show you quickly, is a drawing of Rembrandt of the same scene. And in this one, you can see Saul is just covering his face in despair, and the young David is playing his harp or his lyre over on the left. Now, this brings us to David as the shepherd and the Lord as the shepherd. And really, there aren't images in art that show David as a shepherd so well as these ancient mosaics of the Lord as shepherd. And I wanted to show you these just to bring into our soul experience, what it means to be a shepherd, and to do that um, in the spirit of the 23rd Psalm that David wrote. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leads me on the path of righteousness for his name's sake. And then the tone changes to a direct connection. Lo, though I pass through the valley of the shadow of the death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou layest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup overfloweth. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. These mosaics were done in the 5th and the 6th century in Ravenna, which was in a sort of Byzantine area of Christianity, where they did these exquisite mosaics. This particular one of the Lord as Shepherd is in a tomb called the Galla Placidia. And if you look up into the corners, you can see that it's set in a mosaic of a starry night. And I just wanted to share these images with you of the Lord as Shepherd and David as Shepherd, because I think we need these soothing images to help us and serve as a remedy for us in these trying times. So David was brought into Saul's court as a poet, as a shepherd, as a musician, but the angry Philistines were coming closer and closer to the gates. And one of the images was of the giant Goliath, who's sort of a giant projection of the madness we see in Saul. He's this giant, not just a foot taller, but many feet taller than a normal human, and covered with armor and shields, and clumsy as he challenges anyone to try and conquer him. And David, who's just helping, feed his brothers and tending his sheep, he comes up and he says, well, I will do it. And Saul tries to give him his armor, and he puts on the armor, and then he's like, no, I don't need all this clumsy stuff. He relies on his heart and his mind and his small body and his quick wits to figure out how to conquer this image, which is really an image of dishonesty and grandiosity and needs to be slain by clean precision. And this is a Rembrandt etching. It's a tiny etching. It's about 3.5 by 4.5 inches. And it was done in 1655, later in Rembrandt's life. And it was done for a book called The Piedra Gloriosa, the Glorious Stone, which was a book published by a rabbi in the 17th century, Manasseh ben Israel, who wrote a tract which tried to connect all the stones in the Old Testament and bring them before our eyes. And Rembrandt did 4 etchings, this just being one of 4, which connected the stone that was used to knock over the statue in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and the stone that Daniel laid on when the four beasts came before him in a vision, and the stone that Daniel laid on when he had the dream or the experience of wrestling with the angel. And he connects all those stones with the stones that David uses to slay Goliath. And so then the stone is hurled and um, strikes Goliath in his one vulnerable spot, which is the center of his forehead, sort of the area where in ancient times they believed the third eye was. If you think of the Cyclops being killed by Polyphemus, it's the same kind of image that they can have all this bravado and shields and armor, but they're vulnerable in the seat of conscience and mirroring another human being and having compassion. That is the area where they are vulnerable. And this image of courage in the face of that kind of opponent, I feel is what we need now in this moment. This is, in a certain way, the Old Testament moment that is, to me, similar to when Christ cleans the money changers out of the temple. Christ isn't always just, being calm with his sheep and holding the children. He can bring righteous anger to bear as well. And this David, this figure of David who slays Goliath, is used throughout art history. In Florence in the 15th century, which was a civic state that fought off all of the principalities and people who were ruled by kings and lords and rich people in the church. Florence was the bastion of civic freedom and virtue, where the citizens would choose how to manage the government. It was citizens by and for themselves for the good of all. So David, of course, became an image of this. This is a sculpture by Donatello, who was a sculptor in the 15th century. This is the first freestanding full sculpture that had been done since antiquity, and it is done in bronze. This is a figure of the young David standing over the head of Goliath. And bronze was done in this kind of sculpture with what was called the lost wax technique. You might wonder, how could he make such a thing? And I will show you some details too. In order to make something like this, first Donatello would make a clay model with as much detail as he could, and then the model would be covered with a thin layer of wax. Then the wax coated clay sculpture would be covered with a plaster cast, and hot molten bronze would be poured into that, and the wax would melt. And when you took the plaster casing off, then there would be this bronze sculpture remaining. I think it's pretty difficult for us to imagine how anyone could really have done this. But here is the head of the young David. Here he's shown with a laurel wreathed hat as he stands in triumph over the slain David. This is the rear view. This is the first time that male nudes had been shown for thousands of years, well, over 1,000 years. And it was a statement of the freedom from domination. This is a later bronze statue by Verrocchio, who was a little more restrained. And at this time in Florence, the Medicis had sort of become princes of the realm, and they were a little less interested in this, conquering of freedom. But there still wasn't this version of David. But then when the Medicis were kicked out of Florence and freedom reigned again, then Michelangelo did his famous sculpture. He did it when he was about 26 years old. He was commissioned by the city of Florence to do a statue of David that would stand in front of the civic building. It was meant to stand outside. And it was, sorry, I'm just gonna I just want to tell you. Oh, yes, it was stood outside the Palazzo della Signoria. It was the seat of the civic government of Florence. So it was again a statement of freedom. It it had to be moved inside to protect it. So it's now inside in this dome structure. But what Michelangelo did that was different from what Donatello would did, and he had been a student of Donatello. He chose the moment before David slays Goliath, and you do not see any image of Goliath in Michelangelo's David. What you see is the moment where David is collecting his strength and his heart and his courage and his wits about him to size up the situation and do what needs to be done. Michelangelo did this sculpture in marble. And Michelangelo was a Neoplatonist, which meant that he believed that in this slab of marble, the being of the figure of David already resided. And all he had to do was chip away the pieces of marble and dust that didn't belong there. And that then the image that was in the stone to begin with would emerge. And this is what emerged, is this figure of David who with his left hand uh, is holding the sling and his face is sizing up his opponent. You can see he is taking it all in and pondering in his mind and gathering his will to do what's necessary. That way you can see a better image of the sling and the way his eyes are, his pupils are dilated as they are when you're anticipating that you're going to take on a challenge. This is a close-up of his face, and just try to imagine Michelangelo chipping away the marble that didn't need to be there so that this would remain. This is a back view of the sculpture, and you can see that the figure of David is slightly twisted. There's a sense of incipient action in this twisting. It's called contrapposto, where the weight is on one leg and the left leg is beginning to lift and the left arm is beginning to lift. And here is a detail of the hand that's holding that stone. And you can see the veins are engorged with the anticipation of what is to come. So this image of thoughtful courage has been something that has given people inspiration and grounded their courage and their ability to stand up in the face of what seems inconquerable. So I think this is a moment where we can gather courage from such images. Now, there were also paintings of David, not just sculptures. This is a 15th century painting, and this is very unusual because it was painted on a ceremonial shield. This was in the 15th century by an artist called Castagno, and these shields were used for parades in Florence. And most of the shields were painted with insignias of different families, like a dragon or a cross. This is one of the only shields that was painted with a full image of the young David with the head of Goliath at his feet. And it's just full of energy. It's painted right onto leather for the shield. And you can see this. I think this is in the National Gallery in Washington, if we're still allowed to go there. I'm just going to show you this one briefly. This is an early 16th century painting that was originally attributed to a miraculous painter from Venice called Giorgione. And this is probably not by Giorgione, but one of his school. But I wanted to show it to you because it's called a self-portrait with the head of Goliath. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because in a way, this tells us we are supposed to read these scriptures inwardly. Where is Saul in us? Where is Goliath in us? Where is the David in us? How do we conquer the Saul and the Goliath in us? How do we arrive at the poet and the shepherd and the person who has the courage and the faith in God that is required in order to slay this opponent? This is a painting by Caravaggio from the 16th century. It's also a self-portrait, or maybe even two self-portraits. Here, David is holding the head of Goliath in this deeply introspective, contemplative. There's no sense of conquering and domination here. There's like this inward contemplation of what has occurred. And the self-portrait is in the head of Goliath. That's where Caravaggio placed himself. There's also thoughts from scholars that the young vision of David was a self-portrait of Caravaggio when he was younger, or perhaps one of his young students. But in any way, this is also an image where we are called upon to see in ourselves introspectively, how do we connect with the scripture and find our courage and not boast about what we have done, but take it in inwardly so that we can make the next steps. And what were the next steps for David? And this is one of the slides that did not come out well, but I did want to show you this because what comes out after David slays Goliath and goes to present the head of Goliath to Saul is one of the most moving portions of the Bible, one of the deepest aspects of the book of Samuel, which is the friendship of David and Goliath. Because after the slaying of Goliath, Jonathan, who is Saul's son, Jonathan's soul was knit to the soul of David, knit to the heart of David. And David felt Jonathan's soul was as his own. So this is one of the first times, maybe the first time, that in the Old Testament we see an image of real friendship, two fully realized individuals who have faith in God and are able to connect with each other in this deep, heartfelt way. This is a bit of a better slide with a detail in the surrounding landscape of Italy, of this powerful friendship. And in this one, you can see that David is holding the sword. Jonathan gives him his armor, and there's also an arrow. Jonathan gives him his weapons so that he will have the strength and fortitude and what he needs to protect him from the assaults of Jonathan's own father Saul. So Jonathan pledges, makes a covenant with David because he sees that God has is now present in David. He can see that he is God's anointed. God is after the heart of David. I probably got that wrong, but you know what I mean. This is David is the chosen one of God at this point, and Jonathan recognizes it, and that is the basis of this deep friendship. So the Old Testament being what it is, there are like multiple battles and stories of battles and Saul trying to destroy David, and madness abounds. And I'm not, I won't go into all of that. And the artists, as a rule, didn't go into it. You know, these were artists who were just beginning to read the Old Testament. You know, for thousands of years, they weren't even able to read the Old Testament. They only knew it through images, or, you know, there would be a Latin mass and there would be images that, but this was, you know, the 17th century when the Reformation had, and people could actually read the Bible themselves. And that's when you start seeing a lot of these Old Testament images showing. And this is a beautiful painting by Rembrandt, which was done in 1643, the year after his beloved wife Saskia died. So he was processing a great deal of grief at the time. This image is in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in Russia. And unfortunately, we probably will not be able to see it in person, but there are some beautiful reproductions of it. And you can, when I first studied Rembrandt over 50 years ago, I studied this as the moment when David is forgiving Absalom. But many scholars have studied it in the 50 years since then, and now it is fully believed to be an image of Jonathan saying farewell to David when David has to leave and go out kind of into the wilderness, into the land of the Philistines in order not to be killed by Saul. And down, you know, he has the sheaf of arrows at his feet, and this is where he's out in the field where they've gone. Um, Here's a detail where you can see that there's Jerusalem in the background. You can see this deeply moving moment where the younger David is just pouring out his emotions, and Jonathan, who is older, is more restrained but deeply moved by this movement, this moment of friendship when the two are separated. This is a drawing of the same thing, and it's also like pen and ink with bistre, that burned beech wood. You can see it gives it all this warmth in the background and a deeply moving moment right at the center of the drawing. This is, I'm just going to go through these quickly. This is a student of Rembrandt who did a pen and ink and wash drawing. Again, this movement really attracted people who finally were able to read the Bible for themselves. And these images of this heartfelt friendship in which God was present obviously inspired many artists at that time. So after David leaves and goes off on his sojourn, Saul lapses deeper and deeper into madness. And I'm just going to show you this one painting, which is when Saul, in despair, seeks the counsel of the witch at Endor. This is an Italian painting, I think, from the 17th century. And, having cast out all the legitimate seers from land, he ends up having to go to a witch. Samuel, of course, has died in the meantime, and Saul has no counsel, and he asks for the witch to conjure up the spirit of Saul. He can't see the spirit of Saul, but the witch conjures up the spirit of Samuel, who tells Saul that his future is not bright. And Saul, although he cannot see this, falls to his knees. And you can see this painting shows this image happening in a cave at night. It sort of emphasizes the evil that's in this scene. And this artist, Magnasco, also painted images of gypsies and Jews. He was really drawn to these images of the darker side of the Bible. And this is a detail where you can see Saul falling on his knees, and the calm and wise image of Samuel rising up and the image of the witch side are sort of lurching off in the distance. So while this is happening with Saul, I'm just going to show you one image of all the different encounters between David and Saul and the forces during this time. This is an image, it's a little drawing by Rembrandt. It's tiny little drawing. And it's the moment when David has cut the robe of Saul and is holding it up to show the troops that he has indeed encountered Saul, but he has chosen not to kill him. He is not punitive, and he asks his soldiers not to kill Saul and Jonathan. His heart is still knit to Jonathan, even though they are on opposite sides of the battlefield. So this tender drawing shows that little bit of the robes of Saul. You again, sort of the young shepherd like David holding up his spear, doing his best to both protect the will of God, the Ark of the Covenant, and yet not to slay his dear friend. Now, David then does become king. And he has been anointed secretly by Samuel, and then he gets anointed as king of Judah. This is the tribe from Bethlehem. And the various peoples of Israel gather around him. He's a peaceful and loving king, and he doesn't have to do as much battle anymore. And as is often the case in the Old Testament, he has multiple wives and he has at least 10 concubines. And we have to just accept that that's the way they did things in those days. And I'm going to show you now some images of David's very human side where he is tempted and what leads to his downfall. Because God loves David, but David is free and he can make mistakes, just the way I imagine all of us have made mistakes. Like none of us is going to cast the first stone. This is a painting by Rembrandt. It was done about the same time that the painting of Jonathan saying farewell to David. It's Bathsheba at her toilet. And Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah, and she was just going about bathing and being cleansed. She was married to one of David's faithful soldiers, and you can't see it. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, you can see it. But up in the left, where there are the parapets of the castle of David, you can see David looking up from his castle down to this image, and his um, desire is kindled by the image of Bathsheba. Bath means daughter, and Sheba means shield, the daughter of the shield, or the daughter of the seven. And he cannot quell this desire for something that he is not supposed to have, even though he already would appear to have everything he needs. I wanted to show you this detail of the woman who's doing the foot care for Bathsheba. Rembrandt was very, very conscious of the importance of caring for the feet, and he shows this older woman, it's also an image probably of his own mother, carefully tending to the feet of Bathsheba. And any one of you who has ever had your feet tended or has washed the feet of another on a Maundy Thursday service knows that the care of the feet is one of the most spiritual things one can do or one can receive. And that is what Rembrandt is calling forth in this image of Bathsheba. And in fact, you probably can't see it, but underneath the basin where the sponge for the foot care is Rembrandt's signature. He placed his signature below that image of humility and caring for the feet of another. This is a later painting by Rembrandt of the same story, except it's at a different moment. And I'm just going to stop for a moment and go back to the story of Rembrandt himself. So Rembrandt was married to his first wife, Saskia, for 9 years. They were deeply in love. And Rembrandt was a poor artist who associated with a lot of the Jewish mystics in the neighborhood and all the riffraff. But his wife, Saskia, was wealthy. And so they had a house, and Rembrandt had a studio. Saskia, however, was a bit self-centered. And when she wrote her will, she said that she would leave everything to Rembrandt as long as he did not marry again. So Rembrandt lived in that house, grieving after Saskia died, but after a number of years had passed, he sought companionship, and he fell in love with this woman, Hendrikia Stoffels, who is the model for this Bathsheba. And he was never allowed to marry her because if he married her, he would lose his studio and all his possessions. So, as a consequence, Hendrikia every year had to appear before the magistrates in Amsterdam to be shamed for living in sin with Rembrandt. This was sort of the heritage of his first wife, that they had to, quote, live in sin. I'm just telling you that because I think it's interesting that when Rembrandt chooses to portray Hendrikia as Bathsheba, he also chooses a more introspective moment. This is the actual moment when Bathsheba has received the note from David. We don't see David in this image. He's not even up in the castle looking in. She's seen the image, the note, and she's deeply reflecting in herself. She's going to do something that she knows is wrong. So we're led into this moment very intimately where human beings make mistakes. And this is just a detail of this moment where Bathsheba is pondering on what is to come. Later in his life, Rembrandt returned to this story very late in his life, and he painted this powerful image. This painting is also in the Hermitage in Russia. This is a painting of Uriah. On the left is the new seer who has come up, Nathan, and on the right is the image of King David. So we're taken to that moment where the good soldier Uriah won't go along with David's tricky plan to get Uriah to lie with his wife Bathsheba so the child David and Bathsheba conceived would be thought to be Uriah's. David is a faithful soldier, and so he refuses to do that while his troops are in battle. And so David has to come up with an even more evil plan, which is to send Uriah into battle in such a way that he knows he will be killed. This is a detail of Nathan, who deeply grieves over this horrendous decision of David's. This is a detail of the face of Uriah, and you can see here almost an image of the head of Christ, of someone who's going into his sacrifice in a quiet and deeply introspective way. And here is the head of David looking a little shamed and bashful, certainly not the image of the David we saw either in the young shepherd who could heal with his music or the shepherd who could slay Goliath. This is the David who has succumbed to error. Now, I'm showing you this image. Evie was actually the one who reminded me of this painting. This next portion will be the story of how God responds to David's sin. God still loves David, but he is not happy with his behavior. And he has Nathan tell him that he is going to get a response, it's sort of a karmic kickback from his own household. And indeed, David had other sons by some of his other wives. On the left is David's son Amnon. And then David had several other sons by other wives, but he had a son Absalom by a different wife. So the Amnon's half sister and brother Amnon, Absalom's sister Tamar, who is figured on the right. So you can imagine this household with multiple halves and stepchildren and multiple wives, and then there are the concubines in the background. And Amnon has the same overwhelming impulse to take Tamar, his half sister, who is a virgin, unlike Bathsheba, she is completely virginal, and he uses trickery in order to get the virginal Tamar to come in to serve him food when he is supposed to be sick, and then he rapes her. And this is I believe, a 16th century painting from Venice, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and it just gives you a sense of what is to come in David's life. So Absalom is a unique character in the Bible. He seems to incarnate both the raging of Saul, the beauty of David, the kind of manic or narcissistic ability to attract others and to be deceitful and self-centered. But at a moment after 2 years of gathering the people and attracting them to his reign, he does come and ask for forgiveness from David. There is a moment of this, of where he falls on his knees and his face goes to the ground and David forgives him. And this is a Rembrandt drawing of that moment, which I think is a deeply moving moment where at least there is a sense that there could be reconciliation. And you feel in David, again, that deep connection. He doesn't want to kill Saul. He doesn't want to kill Jonathan. He doesn't want to kill Absalom. But his own misjudgments have led to this moment. Now, the story of Absalom is not one that shows up in a great deal of art. It is a very difficult story to see. And I'm showing you this version of what happens to Absalom from another Psalter. This is a British Psalter from around 1200. It was done in Oxford, England. It's a little miniature Psalter, again, a little book of prayer that someone would use to connect with the Psalms of David and the life of David. And it shows how Absalom, going off into battle on his mule, with his full head of glorious hair, which weighed 2 cubits when it was cut once a year. Here it obviously has not been cut, and his hair gets caught in the branches of an oak tree or a terebinth tree, and he is suspended in the branches of the tree. And even though David has told his soldiers not to kill his son Absalom, his general Joab comes along and pierces Absalom's heart with darts so that Absalom dies. And this little miniature shows both of those parts. Here you can see the image of Absalom hanging by his hair. The translations of the Old Testament are a little confused. It's not clear whether it was his head that was caught in the branches that was translated and interpreted widely as the hair. And it's pretty obvious from the amount of emphasis on Absalom's hair why that confusion would have taken place. But you can see in the 1200, people were looking to these stories to find inner spiritual resonance and a way of praying to get out of the kind of darkness of soul they were experiencing. This is a much later picture of Absalom in the 19th century. This was done by an artist named James Tissot, who was friends with a number of other impressionists like Degas. He was friends with Oscar Wilde. He was friends with a bunch of unusual people in the 19th century. And he did this gouache painting of David, both hanging from the tree and pierced by the arrows. And you can see this in the Jewish Museum in New York City. Well, after David conceived a child with Bathsheba, God made the decision that that child of sin would die. So the first child of David and Bathsheba died. But later, David made his amends and repented, and God forgave his sins, and he was able to lay again with now his wife Bathsheba, and she had another son, and that son was Solomon. And very, very late in David's life, after years of more battling and plagues and all this raging going on in Israel, David, in his very last days, passes his charge on to Bathsheba's son Solomon. David, by this point, is so weakened and wasted. He's very cold. He's so cold that the only thing that will warm him is the embrace of a warm virgin. I think her name is Shunammeh. Evie would know the name better than me. And so he's a very, very diminished figure at this point, but he's still able to pass on this anointing, this charge of his to Solomon. And directly through the line of Solomon, we are brought through the lineage of Jesse and David and Solomon into the Virgin Mary. And I wanted to, I have no idea how long I've been talking, but I wanted to close this presentation with a few images of how this story of David connects to our New Testament and to what we are being challenged to address today. This is a stained glass window, and I will show you some details. It's from the Chartres Cathedral, and I could spend, a whole lifetime talking about the beauty of the art in the Gothic Cathedral of Chartres, which had sculptures and stained glass windows and the architecture itself and the crypt. There's an immeasurable wealth of biblical knowledge that came out of the 12th century school that was centered in Chartres. And this window was dedicated to what's called the Tree of Jesse. And at the bottom of the image, you see the first kings of Judah resting Jesse, from whose lineage through David, on through David and Solomon, and then up to the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary who bears the Christ child, so that there's this DNA genetic link to the house of David built in, which was very important to scholars at that time and to people to this day. This is one of the images of the kings of Judah, and there's all sorts of detail in the figures at the side as well. You can see the radiant cobalt blue. The light shines through this glass and illuminates both in color and in light these transcendently spiritual images, these ones from the Old Testament. And this is an image higher up on the window of the Virgin Mary. Um, she is the last part of the tree of Jesse. Again, these absolutely transcendent blues, and her robe in a warm red. And finally, the top of the window, um, where you can see the figure of Christ himself. And also, like if you look, there seem to be like birds and doves and eagles hovering around him. So all of this has led us to the new shepherd. We start with Hannah, and then we get the seer who anoints a king, and we go and we find a shepherd, and we get the image of the good shepherd. And now we come to the shepherd again, but we also come to something entirely new, which is that Christ is not only the shepherd, he is also the lamb. That is what is new. He is the Lamb of God. So he is not only the one who protects us, he is the one who God sacrifices for us so that we can live with forgiveness of sins, with grace. And we can go into the world knowing that we are graced and we have a purpose in this world, that we will sin, but we will be forgiven. And I wanted to end with this image, which goes back to those mosaics in Ravenna. This is from the 6th century. It's the mosaic. I think this one is in San Vitale, where the Lamb of God is at the center of these four figures, who I think are four figures of the people who wrote the Gospels. But I just especially, I think I have one more, just to show you the importance not only of being the shepherd, but of being able to sacrifice ourselves, to love one another, to live in community, to be welcoming to refugees, to open our